1,000 horsepower used to be a figure that was reserved for only the most elite of hypercars. But pretty soon, it's going to be something that you can just go and buy at your local Chevrolet dealership in the form of the Corvette ZR1. Flashback 30 years ago, and the top-of-the-line ZR1 wasn't even cracking 400 horsepower. But it's not just the Corvette. Across the entire automotive industry, we have developed an absolute obsession with horsepower. The BMW M3, for example, has nearly doubled its horsepower figure during that same time frame, and it's a similar story with the Porsche 911 and the Ford Mustang. Like, we even have pickup trucks now that have 700 horsepower. But I think we may be reaching a tipping point where into the future, there is less of an emphasis on overall horsepower. So today we are going to talk about where this obsession with power came from and where it may lead us in the future. Since humans invented the internal combustion engine in the mid-1800s, we have been experimenting with different ways to get more power out of them. In the early days, this meant doing wild experimentation with different types of engines, different displacements, and even different fuel types. But as the automobile entered mass production in the early 1900s, there grew to be a consensus around the idea that automobiles should mostly use piston engines ranging from 1 to 8 liters of displacement, with between 3 and 16 cylinders in either a V or an inline configuration. And to put things in perspective with the actual horsepower figures that we're talking about here, these cars were probably more similar to a beefy lawnmower than the automobiles of today. The Model T, for example, was only making around 20 horsepower, and even the most powerful car at that time, the Simplex 90, was only making around 90 horsepower. And more broadly, when people talk about horsepower, there is often a fascination with the muscle cars of the 1960s. And it is for good reason. After World War II ended, there was a lot of industrial capacity that was freed up in the United States that could be focused on making consumer goods like cars. But more broadly, this was really the time when the United States fell in love with the automobile. There was a massive infrastructure project underway to connect the continental United States via a network of highways, and what better way to use those highways than in a sleek, stylish, and most importantly, powerful muscle car. And there were truly some very impressive cars that were built during this time, like the 1965 Pontiac GTO Tri-Power that was pushing 365 horsepower. The Ford Mustang Boss 429 was making around 375 horsepower, and even some very special versions of the Chevrolet Chevelle were pushing 400 horsepower. Now, while these cars did offer very impressive levels of straight line performance, even by today's standards, there are a few tricks at play that I think lead people to believing these cars were more powerful than they actually were. For one, the way that manufacturers were permitted to measure and advertise horsepower during this time were different. Cars from this period were typically advertising gross horsepower, which is the measure of an engine's power when it is just on an engine dyno without any accessory drives or other drivetrain components hooked up. And soon after this period, we switched to a net horsepower figure, which is the measure of horsepower that actually makes it to the wheels after drivetrain loss, which is generally about 15% lower than the gross figure. Another factor to consider is that the gasoline at this time was also much different. Generally speaking, it was of a much higher octane rating, and it wasn't totally uncommon to be able to get 100 octane gas at your local gas station. Another thing that helped is that the gasoline at this time contained lead, which is extremely toxic, but also has great anti-knock properties. These two factors combined meant that the cars at this time were able to run a lot more aggressive timing and more compression, and as a result, were able to produce more horsepower. And the last thing I'll point out is that a lot of the engines that were produced during this time were just massive. Like, we're talking 7+ liters of displacement on a variety of different production cars. But all of this did come at a cost. A lot of these cars were horribly inefficient. We are talking high single digits, low double digits for fuel economy. And at the same time, these cars were literally poisoning the air, and I'm not just talking about CO2, although that was certainly present, but the nitrogen oxides or NOx that these cars are putting out are extremely dangerous. But at the time, none of this really mattered because there were very few regulations targeted towards tailpipe emissions, and gasoline was cheap and plentiful. This would all change in the 1970s when the US passed a sweeping set of regulations that affected the automotive industry. And these were spurred on by things like the oil crisis and irrefutable evidence indicating that the types of emissions that these cars were putting out at this time were not only toxic to the US population, but also harming the planet more broadly. So as a result, what these regulations were actually aiming for was to reduce pollution and emissions and to improve fuel economy, and we can largely say, looking back now, that they were successful. But what this came at the expense of were the powerful engines that had reigned supreme a decade earlier. A vehicle like the Ford Mustang basically had its horsepower cut in half to only produce about 140 horsepower out of a V8. And with this increased focus on fuel economy, a lot of automakers decided to downsize and start putting 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engines into their cars. So in addition to the regulations that were focused on fuel economy and emissions, there were also a sweeping set of regulations that were focused on crash safety. This greatly restricted the creative freedom that automakers had with their cars' designs, and largely, people look back at cars during this time period and think that they're pretty unstylish. These two things combined is what the automotive industry calls the Malaise Era. And this era is probably the darkest time in automotive history, where just across the board, companies were coming out with low quality products. Sometime in the mid-1980s is where things would start to turn around. By 1986, Ford was able to crest the 200 horsepower mark again with the Mustang, and by the early 1990s, Chevrolet was able to cross the 300 horsepower barrier with the Corvette. And what ended up driving this was simply technological advancement. Even as regulations continued to get stricter and stricter, automakers poured tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into refining their processes and figuring out how to get more efficiency and more power out of their engines. And in my opinion, another massive leap forward would come in 1996 when Chevrolet revealed their new iteration of their small block V8. And this would be the third generation of that small block, widely referred to as the LS. And in the initial application of this engine, it was making around 345 horsepower. And the reason I'm calling this out is because I think it really underscores just the advancement that has been made with internal combustion engines, because the LS uses a fairly rudimentary design. They are still pushrod, 2-valve per cylinder, single cam V8s, the same basic design that GM has been using since the 1950s. They just figured out how to build them much, much better. But beyond just General Motors, a lot of other automakers were experimenting with new technology to enhance horsepower, with a particular focus on forced induction. Now, to zoom out a little bit, when you hear people talk about the horsepower wars, there is usually a very particular time period that they're talking about. In the early 2010s, Chevy had just revealed their new Camaro ZL1 that was using a supercharged V8 that was making around 580 horsepower, which on its own was very impressive for the time. But in 2013, Ford would drop a total bombshell when they revealed the new Mustang GT500 that used a 5.8-liter supercharged V8 that made 662 horsepower. But it would really be Dodge here who escalated things when a few years later, they revealed the Hellcat to the world. A 6.2-liter supercharged V8 making 700 horsepower that was being put into a car that could reasonably be purchased by the average person. And things would only continue to get wilder from here, with Dodge deciding to put that powertrain into various different SUVs and eventually even a pickup truck. Now, at the high end of the car market, things were really starting to pick up there as well. McLaren had came back onto the scene, and they were producing super powerful twin turbocharged V8s that they were putting into their own supercars and kind of forcing all of the other legacy supercar manufacturers to compete. So not long after, Ferrari would come out with their own twin turbocharged V8 supercars, having their own ridiculous power figures. But during this time, there would be another technology that started getting implemented in more and more cars that would continue to push the performance envelope: electrification. And I'm gonna split this into two parts, one being performance hybrids and the other being full electric vehicles. And to start with EVs, there's a lot of reasons why EVs are inherently good at straight line speed. They have instantaneous power, and that power is a lot simpler of a formula to get at than an internal combustion engine. Basically, big battery, big electric motors makes a fast car. And another advantage with building EVs is that there's just a lot less hoops to jump through for the automaker in terms of regulations for fuel economy or emissions, which is a big advantage over gas engines. Now, with performance hybrids, you're basically getting the best of both worlds. Take a powerful gas engine and then add on a couple electric motors, and you just get absurd total power figures. Now, to take one step back, automakers here aren't just giving their cars more power for the sake of having more power. Oftentimes, they are adding horsepower to new models because it is a good way to sell cars and to help people justify upgrading to the new model. Often, it isn't just the raw power figures that's helping to sell cars, but instead what those end up translating to with 0 to 60 or quarter mile times. And more broadly, it's just a tough sell for the automaker to come out with a new car that has the same power, or God forbid, less power than the outgoing model. It's just not a good business plan. But my main argument here is that I think we may be reaching a bit of a tipping point, where up until this point, horsepower has been probably the most important factor in selling performance cars. But I think in the future, the focus may be about to shift. For one, many cars that are on sale have power levels that are completely unusable on the street. Not only are you going to get sent to jail if you keep your foot in the throttle for too long, but the actual logistics of putting all that horsepower to the ground in real world imperfect conditions is challenging. And to generate and control all of this power, a lot of new performance cars are only being offered with things like automatic transmissions, all-wheel drive, and hybrid powertrains. But beyond just that, automakers have figured out how to make power more accessible. A lot of the time, this means putting a lot of boost into a small engine, but we figured out how to do that and still keep the car drivable and reliable. More broadly, horsepower has just become ubiquitous, which is why I think we may be on the precipice of a divergence. While there are always going to be cars that are chasing all-out horsepower and performance, I think there could be a very strong emphasis put on engagement. And with that comes things like manual transmissions and naturally aspirated engines that, while they may be powerful, require you to rev them out to get at that power. And maybe the perfect example of this is the Porsche 911 GT3, a car that Porsche just raised the price on by like $50,000, and I still expect them to sell every single one. And it is so incredibly popular because it offers a really high level of driver engagement through things like an optional manual transmission and a very high revving, naturally aspirated engine that isn't even the most powerful engine in the Porsche 911 lineup. And this is something we can see at the extremely high end of the car market as well. Sure, there are still the 2,000 horsepower hypercars, but what I hear people talking a lot about are vehicles like the Gordon Murray T50 or the Pagani Utopia. Now, regulations are certain to play a role here as automakers try to navigate both the regulatory environment as well as consumer demands and preferences. But I think with just how accessible horsepower has gotten and sacrificing engagement in the process, we could be thinking differently about what we look for in a sports car into the future.